You're listening to a CNA podcast.
The US is openly demanding control over Greenland. Denmark and Greenland say it's not for sale. Greenland is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, and Denmark's responsible for defense and foreign affairs. And this story is escalating. European allies are now sending troops to Greenland. And in the latest escalation, President Trump has announced new U.S. tariffs on 8 European nations, the ones that have sent troops to Greenland. And this will start on February 1st. Welcome to 2026's hottest geopolitical real estate dispute. So, what happens next, especially when the buyer is the world's most powerful military? Joining me to unpack what's happening between Washington, Copenhagen, Nuuk and Brussels, and what Greenlanders themselves want is our correspondent Ross Cullen, who has been covering this story for CNA. Ross, you were recently in Nuuk, capital of Greenland. Let's start with that. What's the mood on the ground? What did you see and hear from the locals?
Yes, hello, Jen, that's right, in Nuuk in Greenland. And what I did hear certainly was concern, uncertainty. One man specifically said he was disappointed personally in President Trump. They are unsure and confused about the behaviour of an ally towards Greenland, an ally towards Denmark. And we have seen that in the demonstrations. There were anti-US, pro-Greenland demonstrations recently as well. I was at those demos in Copenhagen, and there was a lot of support among the Danish public for the Greenlandic people. In Nuuk itself, at winter at the moment, so it's very cold. Despite the low temperatures, we have seen lots of people out on the streets demonstrating against this. So I'd say the mood on the ground overall is a lot of worry, uncertainty about the path forward, because it does seem that the US policy towards Greenland is tightening by the day.
And the Greenlanders themselves are very clear on what they want. What did their leaders say?
They do have a prime minister as well who represents them, Jens Frederik Nielsen. We can listen in now to a little bit more of what he's had to say.
But one thing everyone must understand: Greenland will not be owned by the United States. Greenland will not be governed by the United States. Greenland will not be part of the United States. We choose the Greenland we know today, and which is part of the Kingdom of Denmark.
And despite the heightened flurry of diplomatic meetings, U.S. President Donald Trump has remained unequivocally clear and very determined about his intentions, hasn't he? Let's take a listen to what Mr. Trump said.
Greenland is very important for the national security, including of Denmark. And the problem is not a thing that Denmark can do about it if Russia or China wants to occupy Greenland. But there's everything we can do. You found that out last week with Venezuela.
Now, Ross, to me, it's striking that Mr. Trump explicitly linked the issue of Greenland to the U.S. invasion of Venezuela. What does that tell us?
It tells us quite a bit. Military action is not off the table when it comes to Greenland. That is, of course, what was deployed by the United States in terms of the seizure of the former Venezuelan president Nicolas Maduro. Now, Greenland is geographically part of the Northern Hemisphere, so therefore technically the Western Hemisphere, which is the arena that Mr. Trump wants to control. He's spoken recently about the Monroe Doctrine, about the US control in the Western Hemisphere. That's US's arena and their backyard. They do not want European intervention or other states' intervention in that part of the world. So it shows us that Venezuela is one thing, but Greenland is certainly another place where he is still focused for the second time round. He previously mentioned it in his first term, so it's certainly not an issue that's gone away.
Now, back in 2019, Ross, Denmark's reply to Trump's idea was a flat no, wasn't it? What have they said this time?
This time round, there have been some very strong words. The Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, has said that if the US were to attack Greenland, then that would be the end of NATO. They have been working very strongly with allies. They have repeated the assertions that it's Denmark and Greenland alone who can decide the future for the self-governing territory. We can listen in to a little bit more of what the Danish Foreign Minister had to say.
It's clear that the President has this wish of conquering over Greenland. We made it very, very clear that this is not in the interest of the kingdom. There's a government in Greenland with support from 3/4 of the Greenlandic population. The premier made it very, very clear yesterday that Greenland, for the time being and for foreseeable future, will remain within the kingdom of Denmark.
Now, the US president has hardened the policy in terms of what will happen to other countries that stand in Washington's way, do not facilitate Washington's acquisition of Greenland. He says that he will be applying tariffs on European countries, 10% from the 1st of February, and then they'll go up to 25% in the summer if the European position has not changed. The European position is certainly still no to the acquisition of Greenland, no to the purchase, no to military action. They have said that they've been blackmailed. That was the words used by the Danish and Swedish prime ministers. We've heard the presidents here in France, Emmanuel Macron, saying that there have been intimidation and threats coming from the United States, and the UK prime minister speaking on the 19th of January, Keir Starmer, saying once again that it was completely wrong by the US to try to use tariffs. And he also said, we stand with Greenland and Denmark. It is up to Greenland and Denmark to decide their future.
The stakes are just escalating day by day, isn't it? The rift is now so wide, it's no longer a bilateral issue between the US and Denmark, isn't it? The tariffs are now on 8 European nations. They're all NATO allies. They're boots on the ground now in Greenland. Let's take a step back here. Why does Greenland matter so much strategically to both sides?
Yeah, boots on the ground. I saw dozens of soldiers arriving in my time in Greenland as well. Danish warships moored off the coast, Danish Air Force planes arriving at the airport. It is in a strategic location, this island, between Canada and Norway, the North Atlantic, in the area of the Arctic, close to Russia, certainly for shipping and trade routes. But the island itself is enormous. It is about the same size as the Democratic Republic of Congo, 3 times the size of Texas, bigger than France and Germany and Spain combined, but with a very small population, just under 60,000. And it is a self-governing territory in the Kingdom of Denmark, but foreign and defence is usually run from Copenhagen.
President Trump has said that Russia and China will take Greenland if the US does not. How much weight does this argument carry? Russia and China have made no comment on this so far.
The Danish foreign minister said that, according to Danish intelligence, there have not been Chinese warships in the waters around Greenland for at least 10 years. China has said that the Arctic should be an area for collective responsibility, for international countries to be working together, not for countries to be pursuing private interests. In terms of the Chinese maritime threat or the Russian threat, all of the research from maritime institutions in Europe follows and agrees with the line which has been put out by Denmark, that at the moment they're not seeing possibility of Chinese or Russian, certainly military action to try to seize the island.
The US is talking about national security, but Denmark is a NATO ally, which is all about the national security of all members. So beyond military bases and national security, how much is this about other issues, for example, resources and shipping routes?
Resources, Jen, Greenland has a lot. It's raw material deposits, a lot of rare earth elements. We know that the US and Europe are trying to wean themselves off a reliance on China for critical minerals. Denmark's territory of Greenland has a lot, from copper and zinc and lead and titanium up in the northwest, and rare earths such as zirconium and niobium down in the southern parts of the country, but also believed to have untapped hydrocarbons, so untapped oil as well. So there is a belief by Greenlanders that they would hope to be able to develop these areas of that industry responsibly for their own wealth. But there is also fear, and I did hear this on the streets of Nuuk speaking to Greenlanders, that if the US came, it wouldn't just be for national security. They would have potential mining, exploration and other commercial interests that were put at risk. The natural environment across the country, Greenland has the world's second biggest ice sheet after Antarctica at points it's 2 miles deep. The weight of the ice is more than 3 quadrillion tons, and it weighs so much it's pushed the land it sits on below sea level. And this ice is starting to melt. And if all of the ice in Greenland were to melt, then global sea levels would rise by 7 meters. So it's a huge quantity of ice. It's a very fragile environment. There are a lot of mineral deposits, a lot of rare earth elements, possibly untapped oil reserves as well. So there is a lot at stake outside national security.
All that long list of the potential of the rare earth and the minerals, that could be rebranded as national security needs too, couldn't it?
Yes.
This isn't the first time the US has tried to acquire Greenland.
No, it's not at all, Jen. 1867, that was the first time the US Secretary of State thought about potentially annexing Greenland and Iceland as well at the time. Then when Denmark was occupied by Germany during the Second World War, Greenland was occupied by the US to protect it. And then at the end of the war, the US wanted to stay and buy the island and offered Denmark $100 million, so roughly about $1.5 billion in today's money. Denmark said no, but they did have an agreement that the US would be allowed to continue operating military bases, and there is already an agreement before all of this started that the US could deploy more troops and build more bases inside Greenland, but the US president wants total ownership. So there has long been US involvement in Greenland, but it's the idea of seizing the territory that has really enraged European allies.
Speaking of seizing of states and history, Ross, now in 1932, the then U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, came up with the Stimson Doctrine, which is a policy that states created because of a war of aggression will not be recognized. And this was in reaction back then to Japan's unilateral invasion of Manchuria. The UN Charter has since incorporated that Stimson Doctrine. So legally speaking, Ross, is there any pathway for the U.S. to acquire Greenland?
That's a question, Jen, that Donald Trump has been posing himself. He says that, in his opinion, a couple of boats turned up a few hundred years ago and claimed the land, and he doesn't understand the legal basis for that. Some people might also argue that a few hundred years ago, a couple of boats from Britain turned up in the United States and claimed the land. There is also that idea as well because of the indigenous people who were there in the United States before. So there's a perhaps shaky ground there to use the idea of a couple of boats turning up and claiming land. There has been Norse settlers and Danish settlers, and there has always been the indigenous Inuit community that have lived there. And then Greenland became, through when Norway and Denmark were running more or less the same kingdom, the Kalmar Union in 1300. Then Greenland became part of Denmark, and then there was long periods where there was not much settling going on when the Inuit community came and went. And we have had recognition since the official Danish settler arrived in 1700 that this has been part of Denmark. So certainly it has been undoubtedly colonized by Denmark, and Greenlanders themselves have gone through one traumatic colonization by Denmark already. They do not want to go through a second possible colonization by the United States.
NATO's Article 5 states that an attack on one member is an attack on all and will warrant a joint response from all NATO members. There's no article, though, in NATO that guides what happens when one NATO member attacks another. Does it? I don't think any founding members of NATO ever imagined the scenario of an enemy within. In a nutshell, is this the beginning of the end of NATO?
That's what the Danish Prime Minister says will happen if one NATO member attacks another. If the US were to seize Greenland militarily, you would have the possibility of NATO troops, maybe Danish or Norwegian or French, in Greenland facing an invasion by NATO troops from the United States. It would be unparalleled, and the French president has said that if that happens, there would be knock-on consequences of great historical significance. We would be in an unprecedented territory. Emmanuel Macron saying that we would all suddenly be living in a new world if the US seized Greenland militarily. NATO at the moment is trying to focus particularly on supporting Ukraine in the war with Russia. So if NATO were tearing itself apart by fighting each other, that certainly potentially would be seen as something that would be greatly impacting its ability to support Ukraine, and it would be a rupture of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was founded in the 1940s and now is facing the biggest crisis so far.
Right. Now, the highest level of meetings between both sides of the Atlantic is the one with U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio with Denmark and Greenland. But that meeting has yielded no resolution. Both sides have not given an inch, except to form a high-level committee and to continue talking.
Yes, we can listen in what the Danish foreign minister had to say.
For us, ideas that would not respect territorial integrity of the Kingdom of Denmark and the right of self-determination of the Greenlandic people are, of course, totally unacceptable. And we therefore still have a fundamental disagreement.
So, Ross, from this point, what are the key things we should be looking out for?
Jen, lots going on this week. There is the World Economic Forum in Davos starting on the 19th of January, the annual gathering of business elites. The summit in Switzerland will be worth watching because the US president has indicated that he will be taking part for the first time since he came back to office in January last year. And there will be lots of European heads of government there as well. So we'll be watching to see if there is any impact, any outcomes from that summit. It's meant to be focused on economic issues. The tariff threat on European trade exports to the United States will certainly be one of those key issues for discussion, overshadowing the whole summit, the US and the Europe. Falling out over Greenland, we will expect potentially further talks at a different level as well. There could be high-level talks involving the prime ministers of Denmark and Greenland and potentially the Vice President of the US again, and we will be watching out to see if the European allies can remain coordinated in their stand that they are taking against the United States.
Ross, thank you so much for your insights on this fast-developing story. I'm sure we'll be talking again soon on this. It was US President Donald Trump in his first term in 2019 who called the purchase of Greenland as a real estate deal. Today, it's rebranded as national security. Greenland isn't just about territory, it's about raw power, consent, and what it means for some 60,000 Greenlanders whose future is being debated far beyond their shores. How much weight will their voices carry compared to the world's #1 superpower? When allies start sending troops and superpowers start talking ownership, the rules of the global order appear to be melting away like Arctic ice. Thanks for joining me on this episode of the CNA Correspondent podcast. It's brought to you by Clara Ong, Tiffany Ang, Nat Vetivero, Craig Dale, and me, Genevieve Wu. Bye for now.